One of the most popular cliches in boxing is the idea of a fighter who had so much potential and could have been so much more, but never reached their full potential due to lifestyle and out-of-ring problems and lack of discipline. It's a story we've heard time and time again about so many different fighters. Well, for me, one of the most accurate examples of a fighter that narrative applies to, and who definitely could have gone way further than he did, is former two-time featherweight champion Scott Harrison. Nordic Warrior here, hope you guys are all doing well. So when I did my Naseem Hamed video, I briefly mentioned a few opponents that I would have loved to have seen Hamed fight during his prime, and brought up a few guys in and around about his weight class who were active at the time. One of those guys who I would have loved to have seen Nas fight is Scott Harrison. Now when it comes to British world champions, and even just Scottish world champions, Scott Harrison is a guy who seems to be all but forgotten. He almost never gets talked about, and it's a real shame because when Scott Harrison was world champion, believe it or not, there was actually a time when he was genuinely considered to be one of the best fighters ever to come out of Scotland. In fact, if I remember rightly, I believe he was the first Scottish fighter in history ever to lose and then regain a world title, and that was a big deal at the time. He was also one of the more popular Scottish fighters at the time and was a huge ticket seller over here. Those of you who have been following my channel for some time will know that I'm originally from Glasgow, where Scott Harrison is also from. I moved away when I was younger and that's how I eventually lost my accent, but I moved back to Glasgow at 16 and I've lived there for over a decade now. And over here, Scott Harrison used to be a local hero. Unfortunately, Scott Harrison, by his own admission, I'm sure, was a very troubled and very unpredictable individual. He had numerous unresolved court cases, numerous assault charges, including domestic issues and altercations with police officers, problems with alcohol, and an uncontrollable temper that even in his prime saw him getting in some serious trouble behind the scenes. It got to the point where he was basically forced by the British Boxing Board of Control to retire in his prime and relinquish his world title. The board basically used his problems and unresolved court cases to destroy his career, and it took him over 7 years of fighting to finally get his license back. By that point he was well out of his prime and he'd done jail time. His career comeback basically proved to be unsuccessful and didn't work out as he'd hoped. His final fight was against a young unbeaten Liam Walsh, who beat him convincingly on points back in 2013. So Harrison turned professional in the mid-90s and early in his career became the Commonwealth Featherweight champion. He also became British champion, beating Richie Wenton over in Sheffield. He went on to beat some pretty prominent domestic level British featherweights such as Gary Thornhill, and he also beat a few former world champions such as Tracy Harris Patterson, Tom Johnson, who he beat on points, and Steve Robinson, KOing him in 3 rounds. Those guys were of course past their prime, but still had plenty of experience, and it was a very risky strategy putting a young, inexperienced Harrison in against them at the time. You'll find if you research Harrison's early pro career, he certainly wasn't babied, compared to a lot of prospects anyway. He travelled quite a bit on his way up, and faced quite a few far more experienced opponents and guys who at times were actually favoured to beat him. Shortly after beating Steve Robinson, he got a shot at the interim title against Victor Santiago, who he knocked out in 6 rounds to win the belt. This then made Harrison the WBO mandatory and got him a shot at the WBO world champion Julio Pablo Chacon. Chacon was a seasoned champion with a record of 44-2 going into that fight, and had won his title on the road and defended it several times. Scott Harrison went on to basically school Chacon and became the WBO champion for the first time. His first title defence was against former world champion from Northern Ireland Wayne McCulloch, who at the time going into that fight, many people favoured to beat Harrison. McCulloch, in my opinion, had given Naseem Hamed one of his toughest fights, and was known for his granite chin and durability, and he went 12 rounds with Eric Morales too and gave him a couple of problems despite losing. So McCulloch at that point in time was a serious threat to the inexperienced Harrison making his first title defence. It was pretty risky to take on somebody like McCulloch in your first defence. And Harrison went on to have one of the best performances of his career that night and went on to dominate every single round, giving Wayne McCulloch the most one-sided beating of his entire career up until that point. This fight was one of the fights that, in my opinion, really made Scott Harrison so popular because, like I said, Wayne McCulloch going into that fight was a big risk. A lot of people thought he was going to beat Harrison, and how one-sided the fight was really put Harrison on the map. Like I said, he went on to really dominate the fight, and it was close to being stopped at times, but McCulloch's chin and durability as well as his experience kept him in the fight, and it made Harrison a big name in Scotland and made the entire British boxing fraternity take notice of him. Unfortunately, in Harrison's very next fight, he took on the crafty former world champion Manuel Medina, who once again had given Naseem Hamed all kinds of problems before being stopped by him late. And the fight was a pretty close technical battle. Medina managed to beat Harrison by split decision, and it was a dreadful performance by Harrison. He was loading up on every punch. He seemed distracted and lethargic, and the whole fight was just being outworked and outboxed by Medina. He had his moments here and there. A couple of the rounds he was able to win later on, but he didn't do enough and he lost the fight clearly, although it was competitive. It's very well known in retrospect that behind the scenes going into that fight, Harrison was dealing with alcoholism and also a lot of legal trouble that definitely affected his performance. Harrison managed to get an immediate rematch and just a few months later won back his world title. He destroyed Medina in the rematch. He walked him down and stopped him in the 11th after a dominant performance which included multiple knockdowns, won back the world title, and the difference between Harrison in that fight and the first fight was shocking. In the first fight he looked tired and uninterested and distracted and slow. In the second fight he was hyped up and just would not be denied. He also worked his jab and threw lots of combinations rather than loading up on every shot. And that was a great performance too, and sadly, despite winning back his world title in such impressive fashion, behind the scenes, his personal life was falling apart. And his next 3 title defences, he had some good performances, a few good stoppage wins against Walter Estrada, William Aberlin, and the undefeated Samuel Kobedi, who Harrison KO'd in the first round. His next fight proved to be one of his toughest, where he got a controversial draw against Victor Polo. Many people feel that he was lucky to hold on to his title that night, but he managed to get the draw. His next fight after that, he took on the veteran former IBO champion Michael Brody. He knocked Brody out in the 4th round with a left hook to the body after an all-out brawl, and Harrison's size, youth and power proved to be the difference. Around about that time, there was some big talks going on for Harrison about having some world title unifications against the likes of Juan Manuel Marquez. Unfortunately though, his out-of-ring issues and unresolved court cases got in the way of any negotiations, and his next and final world title defence against Nidal Hussein from Australia, once again it was a really poor performance from Harrison. He looked lethargic, slow, distracted and uninterested, and despite still being young and in his prime, he looked a shadow of his former self, labouring to a unanimous decision that was fairly unimpressive. Harrison, after that fight, had his licence taken away for getting banged up in Spain and having to cancel a fight last minute, and he basically tried for many years to convince the Boxing Board of Control to give him his licence back, but they were not interested and they clearly wanted Scott to retire. It would be another 7 years before Scott fought again, so he had a long layoff because he couldn't get his licence back, and many considered him retired. But he came back in 2012 and made a surprise comeback on the undercard of Paul Appleby vs John Simpson. He fought an undefeated novice called Gregory Mazet and knocked him out in the 4th round with a series of body punches. That fight was at lightweight, 2 divisions higher than he'd ever fought at before in his career. He had one more fight in a 6-rounder against a journeyman, and the next year took on Liam Walsh. That was the final official fight of Harrison's career, where he lost on points in a very poor performance, and he was just too old and past his prime to defeat the younger, fresher Liam Walsh, who just outboxed him and won clearly on points. So how good was Scott Harrison, and how would he have done in today's era and any era besides his own? What's a real shame about Scott Harrison, in my opinion, is how we never got to see him in a unification fight. I personally think that even if he hadn't won a unification fight, and even if he'd have gotten found out, I think it would have brought out the best in him, in my opinion. Also, there were some pretty big named opponents that he was rumoured to be lined up to fight that never happened, such as Johnny Tapia, who was ringside at his fight against Wayne McCoy and was interested in fighting the winner, but for whatever reason the fight just never materialised. I mentioned Juan Manuel Marquez, who was a champion at the same time, and a fight that Scott Harrison actually wanted for a unification. Those fights, while I would not necessarily favour Harrison to win, I certainly give him at least a puncher's chance. Don't get me wrong, I think Juan Manuel Marquez would absolutely school Scott Harrison, and I would have probably even favoured Johnny Tapia, but he at least had the size and the power to make it interesting. Harrison had a few flaws. For one, he was quite flat-footed and relatively slow by featherweight standards. He also had the tendency to be a little bit one-paced and one-dimensional, a little bit stationary, didn't really move much in the ring, and when he wasn't really that motivated, he would just load up on shots and wouldn't really take his time. He could be a little bit erratic in the ring, and that gave him a few problems at world level, like when he fought Medina, for example, in the first fight. It's a big difference between the first fight and the second fight, so occasionally Scott Harrison could blow a little bit hot and cold and wouldn't always perform to the best of his ability. However, he had a lot of advantages of his own. On the one hand, he was a huge featherweight, one of the biggest featherweights I've ever seen, not in terms of height and reach, but in terms of his body type, his frame and his broad build. He was huge for the weight and had to absolutely drain himself to make featherweight, which may have actually had some negative effects on his body later in life. When he fought at lightweight during his comeback, that was more than likely his natural weight, and he had a great chin, one of the best chins in the entire division in my opinion. He was never dropped in his career. He was stopped one time very early on in his career, but that was on a cut, and it was a premature stoppage. It really shouldn't have been stopped, and it was against an opponent who had like 100 professional fights or something like that, and he was in his first 4 or 5 fights, so he was just down to experience pretty much, and he never got stopped since. He never even come close to getting stopped since. He had pretty good knockout power. He wasn't the biggest puncher and he wasn't the sharpest puncher, but he had thudding power and he was very attritional. He had a lot of late stoppages in his career where he would just use his persistence and his size and strength and his will to win to really break down his opponents late. He was very fit and very determined for 12 rounds and had good stamina and was good at applying steady pressure on a good night on his opponents late. He had some brutal knockouts, and even Wayne McCoy, who was known for having one of the best chins in boxing at the time, barely made it the distance against Harrison. He was physically very strong and could impose his will on his opponents. He had pretty amazing heart too. That's one thing I will say about Harrison. On a good night, when he was so persistent, he had so much fighting heart, and in my personal opinion, just based on his size, power and durability, as well as his heart and will to win, he would have given any featherweight in the world problems. Not saying he would beat them, but I just think he would give them problems based on those attributes, okay? A good chin and good work ethic can take you a long way. I said in my Naseem Hamed video that I would have loved to have seen Naseem Hamed fight Scott Harrison, and some people might disagree with me and point out, well, Hamed was able to beat Medina and Harrison lost to Medina in the first fight, and say, oh, that means Hamed would have easily beaten him. I disagree, and I disagree strongly. Now, obviously, Hamed was a lot more popular than Scott Harrison. Hamed had a much longer and more successful career than Scott Harrison. But, in my personal opinion, that fight would have been really interesting. Now, if you look at the Medina rematch, Harrison destroyed Medina in much better fashion than Hamed did. He also beat Wayne McCoy in much better fashion than Hamed did. And what's interesting about that fight to me, and why I think it would be very competitive, Scott Harrison had several advantages over Hamed. On the one hand, he had a monster chin. Like I said, he was never dropped. He had some of the best durability I've ever seen at featherweight. And the size and strength of Scott Harrison, as well as his durability and his persistence, would have been a big problem for Hamed, who was a knockout artist and who tended to try and draw you into a brawl and catch you with those uppercuts. I think that Scott Harrison, with his size and his strength and his durability, would have given Hamed a lot of problems. And let's not forget that we've seen Hamed down multiple times in his career, and not always against the biggest punchers. And I think that Harrison had the potential to maybe drag Hamed into a fight and made it a brawl, and maybe dropped Hamed multiple times, because Hamed was a fighter, though, as good as he was, he lacked basic boxing fundamentals and fell in love with his own hype and his own power punches. That almost cost him in several fights. I think Harrison, on a good night, say Harrison from the Medina rematch or the McCulloch fight, he would have had the power, the strength, to get to the better of Hamed in a brawl, and could potentially have dropped him multiple times. One thing I can envision about that fight, if Hamed tried to showboat and embarrass Harrison, which, let's be honest, Hamed couldn't help himself, he used to showboat in every single fight. Let's just say that would be a big mistake. Harrison was an incredibly volatile and aggressive fighter, and when he got wound up, he would have absolutely battered Hamed if he felt he was getting clowned and embarrassed. I don't think that would have been a wise strategy for Hamed. I don't think Hamed fought anybody with that kind of chin, size, or power, or physical strength. He fought better fighters, don't get me wrong. I mean, I definitely think that Barrera and even maybe a prime Medina, you know, when he fought Hamed, was a better boxer than Scott Harrison, but he never fought anybody who was that big and that physically strong and that durable. So I think it would have been a really interesting fight. I'm not saying that he would definitely beat Hamed, but I think Hamed could maybe pot shot his way to victory, but at the same time I could see Harrison dropping him multiple times and maybe breaking him down and winning on points due to the knockdown. So I think that would have been a good fight. Harrison also, let's not forget, he never hit the canvas. He had a very good chin, good balance, good boxing fundamentals. He was very fit, and he could fall back on those fundamentals when he needed. Against the likes of Marquez, Barrera, and Pacquiao, and some guys like that, I just think that Scott was too basic for those guys, and he would have probably gotten schooled by them. If Harrison were around today, there are several featherweights I would actually favour him over. You look at somebody like Gary Russell Jr. I mean, could you imagine Gary Russell with those brittle hands trying to ward off a guy like Harrison for 12 rounds? That would be difficult. I mean, Harrison was, like I said, incredibly tough and incredibly durable and was physically strong, and I think he could maybe break somebody like Gary Russell down. If you look at some of the other guys like Leo Santa Cruz, that would be interesting, because Leo Santa Cruz would have superior volume punching and stamina. That guy throws a lot of shots and he's very fit too. So I'd maybe favour him over Harrison, but I wouldn't be entirely confident. You look at somebody like Navarrete, who's a monstrous puncher. I might favour him over Harrison, just based on his power, and I think he may be a little bit too strong and powerful himself, but it would be a really good fight. I'd love to see it. I wouldn't be confident either way in that fight. I think we still need to see a little bit more from Navarrete before I'd be entirely confident there. I would have loved to have seen Scott Harrison fight somebody like Josh Warrington. I think that would have been a great fight. I'd probably favour Harrison, because to me, his chin and power would be the difference in that fight. You know, Josh Warrington's a good fighter on his own right, and on a good night, Josh Warrington can outmuscle and outwork anybody in that division. You know, great volume and great work rate. But I think that the chin and durability of Harrison and just the size and physical strength would be too much for Josh Warrington, who himself is a little bit crude. I'd probably favour Harrison in that fight. It's difficult to say though, because the thing about Harrison, his career is just so disappointing, because we never got to see him in any of these big unifications at featherweight, and it would have been interesting to see him against some of the true world-class fighters of the division, and he would have had a chance against anybody, like I mentioned earlier, just due to the fact that he was so physically strong and so durable. Like, a tough guy like that who has so much durability could give anybody problems. So from my perspective, when I look at Scott Harrison's career in retrospect, he was a very tough, durable, hard-punching, yet limited featherweight. He lacked the fluidity of a guy like Nazim Hamed, or the speed and skills of a guy like Marquez or Pacquiao. He would have always struggled against a faster fighter who would move better than him, because he was quite slow and stationary. but what made up for all that was his strength. He was just so physically strong at featherweight, and like I said earlier, he was a natural lightweight who had so much size and strength, so it would have made him an issue for anybody in that division. It's a real shame that we never got to witness it. You know, we never got to see any unifications, and his career was basically cut short in his prime, which is a real shame. So he was only 28 when the board took away his boxing license, and his troubled past and his lifestyle certainly didn't help his cause, and his inconsistencies and his problems with alcohol and with aggression outside of the ring, it just blew what could have been a fascinating career, man. So all in all, he was a fighter who's full of what ifs and speculations. Thanks for watching, guys. I really enjoyed making this video, and yeah, I'm looking forward to doing some more retrospective boxing videos like this in the near future. This is the type of content that I've wanted to do for quite a long time on here, and if any of you guys have any tips or suggestions for how I can improve it, let me know in the comment section and I'll think about it. Leave me some of your suggestions for future retrospective boxing video ideas. I do have a few fighters in mind to talk about, but I just need to obviously spend time watching them and doing some more research first. So any fighters you want me to talk about, any careers you want me to review, let me know. So yeah, thanks for watching and God bless.